I'll introduce myself. I'll take you sort of through a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about today. Let me start my timer, actually, make sure I'm all set. I do want to sort of foreground this. Well, actually, I can go to that first slide. By saying a little bit about who I am. So, as I was kindly introduced, I'm a political scientist. I'm at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. I'm also affiliated with Oxford, where I teach on the innovation strategy course, and where I used to lead a module called Tech for Impact, which is where I first sort of started bringing some of these ideas in. I'd found working with business school students, they were very keen on, the refugee crisis. There's an app for that. And that was very much the mindset. And so it was a way for me to smuggle in some sort of science and technology studies, some critical digital studies into their MBA experience. And I'm a qualitative political scientist. Some of my greatest mentors have been anthropologists, and the work that I do is very field work based. I really cut my teeth, and sort of my first core interests were all around post-conflict transitions. I've done sort of some different work subsequently, but post-conflict work is really where my first passion is. And so this opportunity to speak with you guys, I thought I would bring some of those themes. The lower picture is me learning how to decommission weapons, which is a skill I don't get to use very much anymore, but I'm sort of obligated to include that picture. So yeah, like I said here, I'm interested, I've worked on things about when corporations work with the poor. I'm interested in distributional questions about who gets what after war and why. And the theme I'm going to be talking about a little bit here is sort of how do states, so sort of an entity recognized by the UN as a state, become a state in the sense of, a legitimate authority, a monopoly on legitimate use of force, if we go back to Weber. And these themes of legitimacy, I think, hopefully sort of resonate with your questions around trust. And I think also this question of identity and power, I think are very key to way political scientists look at states. And so I hope there's going to be some resonance there. So I'm coming at this from probably a really different angle than many of you work, but hopefully it's one that's stimulating. And just one more intro slide before I get into the argument. Like I said, I'm from Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and this idea, innovation is political, which is on our tote bags and our pens and all our merch, is what brought me there. And I've been working around innovation, I've been working around politics, and to see these really brought forward, both this idea that there are political implications to innovation, but also that there's a political process and citizens are involved in some of these innovation trajectories. Both these meanings of that slogan are important to me and something that we care a lot about. So without further ado, I'll get into the sort of argument. So what I want to talk about today is this idea that identity and creating and controlling identity is central to state building projects. I'm particularly interested in new states and post-conflict states. So either states that are emerging out of a colonial context, emerging out of a civil war context. And I'm thinking about this both in terms of what I'll discuss as infrastructural power, but also symbolic power. So I'll talk about both those terms. And then the sort of second part of this, or the proposition, how do digital identity systems change the state building project? And in the particular, the relationship of people to the state. And this is one of these sort of Foucauldian questions. What does digital do? I'm not so interested in, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? There's a lot of the sort of ICT for D literature, which says, well, here's an example of this being used to usefully incorporate people into this kind of economy or this kind of system. And then you also see, well, here's a case where it's been used in an exclusionary way. I'm not so interested in balancing those arguments. I'm more interested in this question of what does turning something to a digital system or using a digital identity system change about this relationship of people to the state. And then taking it, looping back to that first piece, and what are the implications of this as we're thinking about digital identity systems, if these are becoming more and more dominant in post-conflict contexts? And I think the important thing to say is we, or I should say my scholarly community of people who look at post-conflict transitions, know a lot or think we know a lot about this idea of identity, state building, power. There's been a lot of really good work there. But this connecting it to digital identity systems, bringing in this question of digitalization, bringing in this question of how that changes the relationship of people to the state is much more nascent and much more exploratory. So I'm going to talk sort of about what we know, and then I'm going to do a little bit of riffing on what we can infer or learn from people who have been studying digitalization and particularly digital identity programs. So that's sort of the way we'll run. But I wanted to start out by doing just a little bit of discussion of state power. And I sort of apologies to those of you who did a lot of this work or political scientists, but for others, I hope this is interesting. We often talk about states having different types of power. One of these types of power is despotic state power. And the most famous work on this is by a scholar called Mann, and he talks about the Red Queen saying, "Off with your head." So authoritarian states will have high amounts of despotic state power, which is basically, coercive power that is unconstrained by civil society. And then there's also this idea of infrastructural state power, which is the reach of the state, its ability to do things. And so with despotic power, this is exactly what I said. This is a range of actions which can happen without being negotiated with civil society. We're actually less interested in this because modern states are sort of characterized by having less and less of this despotic power and much more governing and ruling through infrastructural power. This is in part because one of the things about despotic power that Mann writes is, once you're out of sight of the Red Queen, she has difficulty getting to you. So states that lack infrastructural power lack the ability to see their citizens, where their citizens aren't legible. It's actually much easier to hide. And this is something where if we talk about very weak states or weak authoritarian states, if you sort of go off the grid, metaphorically or even literally, you can sort of hide from the state, or states where there's weak infrastructural power because of potentially their colonial history. So this is sort of the weakness of despotic power, despite being considered sort of what most people think about when they think of state power. They think of policing, they think of sort of bellicist view. Whereas infrastructural power is this idea, the term they often use is penetration. So the capacity of the state to actually penetrate civil society, to implement logistically political decisions throughout the realm. And there's no hiding place from this. It's very much, to use the scholar James Scott, it's about seeing, it's about legibility, it's about understanding who your people are, and then organizing people so that they make sense to the state. So putting them in categories that are legible or tractable to the state, whether that be men and women, whether that be caste, whether that be ethnicity, making classifications that make people governable. So all of that work we sort of put into this infrastructural power. And I would put digital ID as being, very much in this space about expanding and centralizing and making people legible. But there's a third category that often gets left out. Mann really works with those too, where I also think digital identity is relevant. And that's this idea of symbolic power. And this is super important in state building contexts because there's not the assumption that the state is there. There's not the assumption that the state is the right actor to wield force. I'll talk a little bit more about the case I know best and that I work on, East Timor. There was Indonesian occupation for about 25 years, during which there was a highly legitimate Timorese resistance movement, where you have them doing jungle justice, you have them keeping records, you have a sort of a parallel state that's running within. And you see this also with, Tamil tigers. There's a very classic case of them handing out speeding tickets. You have this bureaucratic action happening by non-state actors in these conflict areas that become super interesting for us that care about sort of theorizing the state. And so when you've got a new state emerging, there's this really sort of complicated tipping point where you might have structures that were highly legitimate. So, people who are part of the resistance movement that were settling disputes or giving out speeding tickets or something like that. And then you've got this growing or nascent state that needs to shift the locus of authority to the new state to claim and monopolize that legitimacy and that legitimate use of force. So you've got this really interesting tipping point. And so symbolic power is this idea that the state is the right, natural, given, the right actor to do things, and that things that the state does are normal, which if done by anyone else would be intolerable. And we talk about surveillance often in this situation. Of course, the state has my biometrics. Of course, that's totally fine. Oh, I'd feel totally uncomfortable if a different actor had that. Maybe not these days with corporations holding a lot of our data too. I'll sidebar that. Of course you can take my son in a draft and send him to war. Of course, that's totally fine. Whereas that would be completely intolerable, right? So you need that symbolic power. You need the state to become that actor in order for it to function, which is sort of a really interesting chicken and egg problem around trust, which maybe we can come back to. And there's wonderful scholarship by a person called Mara Loveman who says, how does a state establish that? And a lot of the research is saying, well, through these sort of mundane acts, through things like history museums, through architecture, and through data collection. And Appadurai, another really wonderful scholar in this area, talks about, the census has the benefit. He's talking about numbers in the colonial imagination is the piece this is from, talking about colonial rule, saying the census in India was important both for gathering data that the state uses, but maybe even more importantly, for creating the illusion of bureaucratic control. So the collection of the data is the expressive or communicative act, and whether that data just goes into a big pile and never gets used is kind of secondary. So this sort of symbolic power of data collection actually might be secondary or even more important than whether or not it actually increases this infrastructural power of the state. Can the state even use the data that it's collected? Which I think is probably a theme that you all have worked on or thought about in certain ways. And so I've pulled a little quote from Loveman here, again, pulling out these ideas of these mundane state practices of census taking, map making, museums, architecture, that help to sort of say there is a state here. So that sort of lays some of the foundation for my argument. And again, just to draw it back, my core research has been around East Timor, again, a really interesting post-conflict state that's looking at how do you consolidate state power across. And I was particularly interested in identity around this question of recognizing people who'd been part of the resistance movement. This poses some really wonderful identity challenges, because if a resistance movement is successful, it's keeping very few records. Everyone is working with code names, right? And we've seen that East Timor has a nice example of this, and then also South Africa in terms of the resistance, the apartheid resistance movement, where it's a clandestine movement that as the state changes, there's an effort to recognize people who contributed, but then how do we have authoritative or build authoritative records around what had been a secret movement? So you've got these really interesting challenges. My research looked at this question of how were there creation of categories, how were people classified? It was a really messy and long conflict. And so there was almost a laundering, like a money laundering, an identity laundering process of people who maybe, you were only supposed to be recognized if you carried a gun, right? That was one of the criteria. But maybe the person carried a gun for a while, or maybe they did something else that helped. And so a lot of these different sort of this ambiguity was cleaned and sort of organized into these categories of you're a veteran or you're not a veteran. And if you're put in this category of veteran, then it unleashed some really significant state resources in terms of a pension, which ended up being a huge amount of their national budget. So, these identity processes, particularly around historically significant identities, so historically salient identities like a veteran, are extremely important, both for how the state forms after conflict, but also building up this perception of the state as important and there. And people's participation in the taxation, people's participation in the legal system, their trust in government, all of these things are tied together. Then just a final point on this sort of the theory side of things. I've been very influenced by work by some anthropologists, Ferguson and Gupta, but there's others who talk about what does it feel like to be in a state, which is kind of a weird question. I think particularly for all of us, or many of us who've sort of grown up in strong states or very present states, the sort of where would you need to go to not be in a state, or what does it feel like to not be part of a state? And they make this argument that the feeling of being in a state is this verticality. So there's someone watching you. So the image that I've put there is a camera, and that the state's also encompassing, it's all around you. So it might not feel like you're being observed, but you're seeing evidence of the state in terms of public works, in terms of public goods, in terms of signs, things like that. That's everywhere. And so that's that feeling of being in a state. So now I'm going to transition to talk about sort of the more speculative side of this discussion. So this question of the feeling of a digital state, or what would the transition to doing some of this identity work digitally do? So, one response, again, to this idea of, if we are recognizing that building identity and the state's role in identity is important for state, or that identity is an important practice of state building. It's very contested in new states. What does doing it digitally, what difference does that make? And I think there's a whole group of scholars who would say, what's old is new. We've been studying the collection of data, its use, censuses. We've been looking at that over time. We've studied this in colonial contexts. So what's old is new. This is a continuation of the same conversation, and that actually there's very little that's different. This idea of creating the illusion of bureaucratic control continues, and it's just that the guy's collecting the data on his phone rather than on a clipboard. That we really, this change to digitalization or to digital identity doesn't matter. And that, the practices that we care about, the negotiation over which category you go into, that still happens, that's still where the action is. And, how this is stored, how this is controlled doesn't matter. That's one position. I think most of us probably don't agree with that. But I think it's sort of worth phrasing that, there can be a view that this is a continuation more than something radically new, even though it has a new labels. But I think the other question of, if we think about, this process that I observed in East Timor of gathering people's identities, sorting them, changing them, how that contributed to a state building process. What if that was happening now? What if that was happening 20 years in the future and this was biometrically driven, if this is going to a much more centralized database, what would that change? And so, there's been work on saying that this view of sort of a platform-based view of digital government is a way of bringing in different players, of opening to private action. So would that sort of change the constellation of players? some really seminal work on the introduction of new technology comes from a scholar called Barley, who looks at saying, when a new technology enters an organization, it changes who's important in that organization. He did this really famous study of CT scanners into Boston hospitals, and saying, well, the relationship between the techs and the doctors changed. So, who would be more important now if East Timor was using this kind of system? What complementary systems become entangled? There's very little banking infrastructure in East Timor. If this was becoming a centralized point for distributing pensions, what other sort of complementary assets would need to be developed? What type of regulation? What else would need to be involved? Another point that becomes really interesting, and that's very common in sort of the critical ICT for D literature, is this question of, when something becomes digital or when a technology is introduced, does this actually amplify inequalities? The argument had always been, you give someone a cell phone, they're able to access these networks, it opens up new opportunities. But what Toyama's research showed is that, well, you give someone who already has a really vibrant network, a cell phone, and they're able to access that and build it and use it. But you give someone who's more marginalized, who doesn't have that existing network of phone, and they're not able to do the same thing with it. The social envelope around the technology matters a huge amount. And so technologies can amplify inequalities. So people who are already having difficulty with identity, with interactions with the state, this is going to further that distance, that alienation. There's also a question of what becomes fixed, whether, what becomes difficult to change, and also what becomes more mobile. A quick aside here, when I did my research on ex-combatants in East Timor, I interviewed over 200 ex-combatants, and that was made possible by having a really complete sampling framework. And the reason I had that very good sampling framework was because I went to a UN office and said, hey, do you have a list of all the registered veterans in East Timor? And the guy said, sure, and loaded the entire database of Timorese veterans onto a USB drive and gave it to me. And in a world prior to sort of digital, that would not have been possible. I could not have filled the boot of my truck with all these records. Whereas, it's something that's supposed to be in some ways more secure, and in some ways is much more secure. You can't burn down the records office. Actually becomes much more portable. This is something you guys know extremely well. But sort of, I had to keep a poker face when he handed me back that set of documents on my little USB drive. So there's, it opens up new challenges there. What practices change and to what effect? I want to focus though on this final question. I think all of these are worthy of research in their own way and can be answered in their own way. So I want to think about this final one before closing. I'm glad that Aadhaar came up in the discussion. When I was looking at this sort of question of digital identity and the state, and the relationship of people and the state and how that's mediated through things like digital identity. One of the best articles I read was by a scholar called Chowdhury in a recent special issue. And he made the argument that, all the promise of Aadhaar has been even a less traumatic, that is to use the language, a less traumatic and simpler relationship between people and the state. And this is very much sort of a high modernist view that through technologies we can simplify, clarify, make things more seamless and professional. And maybe that is the case in some places, but he's an anthropologist. He's gone and said, well, let's actually look at what did we meet this promise? Was that promise met? And his argument was that actually this system hasn't created that sort of less traumatic experience. And he said that what's been the result is the state is rendered more distant, opaque, and seamful. Distant in the sense that if something needs to be resolved, people literally need to travel farther to get to the right place to solve it. So some of it is quite sort of literal in that way, but also sort of distant metaphorically. Opaque in the sense that the tools that people would have used normally to resolve issues around, my biometric isn't working, my name is written wrong, my age was incorrect, all of these resolving all these common little problems that you see normally, people don't know how to solve those as easily. The sort of normal channels you would talk to your local representatives, or particularly the discussion was around people who were normally available and who you could negotiate with, that was no longer available. And then he uses this term seemful. This is to talk about the idea that the state, rather than seeing cohesive and coherent, you were seeing all these issues where parts of the state weren't talking to each other, parts of it weren't working together. And so it was making a more disjointed experience for citizens. So this is sort of these big promises about Aadhaar. And he's saying, well, actually, in terms of the citizens' experience of the state, it's making it different or changing it in these ways. And this, to sort of push on this critique, there's a wonderful scholar called Duffield who talks about sort of technology mediated relationships. And here he's talking about research, but it's a very similar critique to what Chowdhury raises. So he's talking about the difficulty of studying states in conflict, and saying this increasing interest in using digital tools for this, and the potential loss of ground truth. And so he says, rather than to critically interrogate the loss of ground truth, science normalizes our remoteness of the world by providing a workaround to recoup distance digitally. In so doing, what Hannah Arendt has called world alienation is being vastly augmented. So this is sort of the polemical side of this, is we think about digital identity as making these relationships simpler, but there's also the possibility of them making relationships more remote and more opaque, of alienating people from the state. And so this raises this question of, if we have the potential, and I'm not saying this is always the case, of these systems making the state feel more distant, opaque, and seemful, how can systems be designed for them to be more local, accessible, and even negotiable? And this might be at odds, right? For identity to be able to be negotiated, for these systems to be sort of two-way streets, from things to be opaque to transparent, and then from being seemful to being coordinated, cohesive, and encompassing. And this all sort of matters because we care about people, we care about their experiences, their state. But I think it also speaks to, in these very fragile moments when states are forming and when you're building a new relationship between people in the state in these post-conflict transitions, what kind of state are we building? What tools do we have that are available? And if part of what we need to be doing is creating a legitimate state that feels responsive to people, how can that be designed into any kind of digital system so that we don't end up in this sort of inaccessible or alienating situation, which may have sort of potentially longer term consequences? So those are my sort of reflections on these themes. Maybe a little bit out of left field for you guys, but I really enjoyed the opportunity to think about this nexus of state and digital identity and post-conflict reconstruction. So thank you all so much.